Sorry about that. Computer's just being a little funky. Okay, so we left off with the Reagan era in the 80s. Now we're heading into post-Cold War era goals because the Cold War is coming to an end in the late 80s and in the early 90s. Is this cool? Go good. Post-Cold War era goals and policies in the U.S. Foreign aid to countries in need. A lot of that was done through USAID that was started by Kennedy during the New Frontier program. That's been under recent attack with the creation of DOGE and the Trump administration. Humanitarian aid to people across the world, USAID, support for human rights around the world, notably the United Nations. The UN gets itself involved in multiple events in the 90s. We're going to talk about a couple of those today. Increase in global trade, access to free global markets. There's a significant expansion of global trade in the post-Cold War era. We see a lot of growth in the 90s and in the early 2000s, promoting democracy, strengthening international institutions, and addressing numerous global challenges. Unrest in Africa, we'll talk a little bit about that today. The Middle East, which we discussed last class. North Korea, which we talked about all the way back during the Cold War. China, that we talked about during the Cold War, and former satellite countries of the Soviet Union, which are now pushing for nationalism, but their nationalism and independence is going to lead to some pretty violent war that unfolds in the 1990s. Most of these policies are under Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Not that Trump, Biden, and Trump again haven't had to deal with a plethora of Cold War leftovers, as I would call them. Obviously, this, with the rise of Vladimir Putin's reign in Russia, that's intensified. But there's also issues in the Middle East, as well as with North Korea, China, etc. Any questions about post-Cold War era goals and policies? All right. President George H.W. Bush, World War II vet, Yale grad, former head of the CIA, and served as vice president under Ronald Reagan. He's going to win in a landslide victory in the election of 1988 against Michael Dukakis. He swore in his campaign, "Read my lips, America, no new taxes." But the problem is he will inherit what from the Reagan era? Starts with a D. You're on the right path. Deficit. Very good. He inherits the Reagan era deficit that was brought on by military spending and the tax cuts. So ultimately, taxes will have to be put into place to try to offset the deficit. Fall of communism in Eastern Europe, which it wasn't like a kumbaya moment in Eastern Europe when the satellite countries are trying to gain their independence and carve up what lands they believe to be theirs. The reunification of Germany, as well as Berlin, which we've already discussed in the Reagan era. Collapse of Yugoslavia, which led to some really violent civil war that unfolded. These are the Yugoslav wars. They really, the pot was boiling in the 80s, but it all really starts to unfold in 1990. And this is going to take place throughout former Yugoslavia. I'll give you a better idea of what that looked like when we take a look at the map. Breakup of the Soviet states, civil unrest in Bosnia, but the Bosnian issues falls more into Bill Clinton's lap. The biggest event internationally that occurs in the George H.W. Bush administration will be the Persian Gulf War, 90 to 91. The Gulf War was a war waged by a UN coalition force led by the U.S. against Iraq. Iraq invaded Kuwait under the regime of Saddam Hussein for oil, petroleum, and also port access in the Persian Gulf. I've got a map of that as well, so it'll make a little bit more sense. That invasion occurred on August 2nd, 1990. The Gulf War in Kuwait was the first war in which American women served in combat. This is known better to us as Operation Desert Storm. Any family members serve in Operation Desert Storm? Okay. Uncle? Yeah, that's what I thought. This was the name of the U.S. military response in the Gulf. 147 American military personnel were killed in action, some of which were Virginians. There is a part of the Virginia War Memorial that recognizes the sacrifice of the Persian Gulf veterans that were that lost their lives in Kuwait at the Virginia War Memorial. Only one termer because he raised taxes to combat a major deficit from the Reagan era. I also want to point out Ross Perot. Has anyone ever heard of this guy before? He's a World War II vet and became basically like a millionaire off of, well, I guess he started with IBM and then he started his own competing firm out of Texas, and he became a tech millionaire as a result of this. And he's going to run as an independent, but what he's pushing for is for American jobs to stay in America, because where are jobs starting to move to? Abroad, very good. Any ideas where jobs are starting to move to? Overseas? Anyone? Nobody? Yeah? Yeah, they're moving to developing countries because labor is what? Cheap. Very good. So Perot will cut into the Republican vote. This will open up the door for the first baby boomer to be elected president, and that's going to be Bill Clinton in the election of 1992. Bush, I will say, though, he kind of takes on that sort of Jimmy Carter type of mentality to keep staying involved in humanitarian efforts in his post-presidential years. Top left, these are ground forces here in Operation Desert Storm. That is the U.S. commander of all ground forces. That is Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf on the top right there, or sorry, over here on the top left. He's to the right in that picture. I'll go to the bottom left. I think this is Operation Desert Storm. This is the UN coalition. You can see American divisions, you can see British divisions, and you'll understand why, if you see this map, why Iraq invaded Kuwait. It's not only rich in oil, but look at that access to the Persian Gulf for trade. Bottom right here, we have an American woman serving in combat in Operation Desert Storm. And then over here on the top right, this is the former Yugoslavia. And what we see occur is we see war happening on the border of Yugoslavia and Croatia, in Bosnia, in Kosovo. And also what happens is that this is a resurrection of issues that date back to before World War One. And remember, after World War One, through Versailles, a lot of this had been carved up. And then after World War Two, they fell under the guise of the Soviet bloc, right? So there's some pretty horrible genocide that will unfold because there are cultural, religious, and also a power vacuum that is taking place in this part of Eastern Europe after the end of communism and the collapse of the USSR. And this will pull American forces into the fray through UN action and NATO action that we'll talk about here momentarily. So, election of 1992, young Arkansas governor, saxophone playing, Yale graduate, very much appealed to your grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, not all, but many. What benefited Clinton is he ran as a centrist. He ran as a moderate Democrat, right? His goal was to embrace technology, get the economy rolling, develop jobs in the U.S., expand trade. But he does push for some liberal social programs, like one thing in particular that he wanted was universal health care, that he was never able to make happen. That'll come later in the Obama era. One particularly important event is the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. That is a trade agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. It was actually spearheaded by George H.W. Bush. There is good, bad, and ugly with NAFTA, like any trade deal. The good is that you're moving a lot of products, whether it be manufactured goods or agricultural goods or petroleum or oil, between these three nations. But there's some bad and ugly, and that is a lot of jobs leave the U.S. as a result of NAFTA to try to drive down labor costs. Also, America didn't always receive the most fair part of the trade deal in these scenarios. So NAFTA has been heavily criticized. Some people think NAFTA is the greatest trade deal. Some think that it's a horrible trade deal. And there have been conservative forces in our lifetime, especially yours, that have tried to dismantle NAFTA to give America a better slice of the pie here. Full diplomatic relations with Vietnam, Socialist Republic of Vietnam. This now opens up trade with Vietnam. What does this mean for companies like Nike? What might they do now that trade has been opened up and we have full diplomatic ties reopened and economic ties with Vietnam? What might a company like Nike decide to do in Vietnam? What's up? What might they do? Build factories. Very good. They're not going to be the only one. Other American companies start building factories to have a footprint in Vietnam. So, for a variety of reasons, this expands you into the Asian market, but what does it also do for labor costs? Drives them down, right? So that, again, this is a good thing, but there's also some issues here. U.S. intervention in Somalia in October of 1993. Are you all familiar with the Black Hawk Down incident? That occurs in October of 1993. Lifting of economic sanctions against South Africa when its government ended the policy of apartheid. And then that goes on to lead to the release of Nelson Mandela from jail and ultimately his election as president of South Africa in 1994. If you're not familiar with apartheid, it's a system of legal racial segregation enforced by a government. It's similar to Jim Crow laws. It was the Dutch Afrikaner that were in charge of the government in South Africa. Are y'all familiar with apartheid? We talked about this last year. Yeah? Okay. NATO action in the former Yugoslavia to end civil unrest in Yugoslavia. This is where they're discovering genocide. Crusader for American welfare and healthcare. The opioid crisis begins in the mid-1990s due to Purdue Pharma. This is absolutely horrible because by the time we roll into the 90s, we are starting to get out of that crack epidemic and we're moving out of the heroin epidemic that had started in the during the Vietnam era and in the post-Vietnam era. The heroin problem was happening in the 60s and 70s. The crack problem more so in the 70s and 80s. Well, that's being tamped down. And then Purdue Pharma gets a license for what? Deadly pill. Anybody know what it's called? Anybody know what the deadly pill is that Purdue Pharma? Oxycontin, very good, or oxycodone. But the problem was, yes, it was a time-release pain reliever, but Purdue Pharma encouraged these doctors and provided doctors with benefits to keep ramping it up. And the epicenter of all this was in Appalachia. And as they ramp up the dosage and they ramp up the strips, people start to become addicted. And then when it's clamped down, we end up with another heroin epidemic, fentanyl epidemic, and methamphetamine epidemic. And we're still struggling to get beyond that. So that's comes about in the late 90s, yeah.
Why did they prescribe so much?
Because we were making money hand over fist. It was cheap. It was super cheap to make. But the way that they put up a pain chart and said, hey, where's your pain? And it's like, oh, I'm sad face. Okay, here you go. It gets to the point where they're like, they're jumping up the dosage of pills from, 10 to 20 milligram pills. They're like doling out like 80 milligram pills, and the FDA is not really stepping in to stop it. It's going to take years for this to be clamped down, and the people responsible for this, they're still tied up in court cases today, which is really crazy. Really tragic book. Has anyone ever heard of Beth Macy's book, Dope Sick, before? It's an award-winning book. She's from Roanoke. She wrote this book. Basically, it's an expose. It's kind of like a muckraking book about the opioid crisis. Clinton was nearly impeached due to perjury over the Monica Lewinsky scandal. A little bit about that. During the government shutdown in the Clinton administration, he and an unpaid intern had an extramarital affair, and he was like, well, not for her, but for him, and he said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. But he did, and, well, they didn't get him for the affair. They got him for perjury because he lied about it. But he was acquitted but there was an impeachment trial. So Clinton was a two-termer, and similar to Carter, Reagan, and Bush, will get involved in humanitarian efforts in his post-presidential era. His wife will be elected as senator from New York. His daughter Chelsea also super involved in humanitarian efforts. Obviously, we know his wife will run for president in 2016, which we'll talk about momentarily. Dramatic changes for the Supreme Court since the 1980s. The membership of the Supreme Court has become much more diverse, including women and minorities. Sandra Day O'Connor, first woman to sit on the Supreme Court. That was in the 80s. She was nominated by Reagan. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, second woman, sixth Jewish justice. She was nominated by Clinton. Clarence Thomas, second African American after Thurgood Marshall, nominated by George H.W. Bush. Sonia Sotomayor, third woman, first Latino, nominated by Obama. Elena Kagan, fourth woman, eighth Jewish justice. Obama. Amy Coney Barrett, fifth woman on the court. Trump. And then Ketanji Brown Jackson, sixth woman and first African American female justice on the court. That was Joe Biden. Civil rights movement of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. None of this would have been possible because without the civil rights movement, women and African Americans would not have had the opportunities they had at this level in law programs. Because if you look at all of these people, they went to top tier law programs in the U.S. Stanford, Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Princeton. But at the end of the day, the Supreme Court protects the individual rights in the U.S. Constitution, identifies a constitutional basis for a right to privacy that is protected from government interference, and invalidates legislative acts and executive actions that the justices agree exceed the authority granted to government officials. That's why in the second Trump administration, there's been a lot of butting of heads between the Trump administration and the Department of Justice, because some of these justices feel that some of the executive action in the second administration has been an overreach. Significant Supreme Court cases from the 20th century that are very important for individual and civil rights. Brown v. Board, 1954, which we've already learned about, overturned Plessy and desegregated public schools. Mapp v. Ohio, decided in 1961, illegally seized evidence cannot be used in a state criminal trial. Gideon v. Wainwright in 63 guaranteed the right to legal counsel for criminal defendants. And Miranda v. Arizona in 66, criminal suspects must be read their rights before police questioning. What do we call those rights now? Miranda rights. Very good. So this is just scratching the surface. There are numerous other cases that we can point to. Space race technology at the turn of the 20th century. NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Remember, we talked about the space race from the post-World War II Cold War era. Space exploration will expand into the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. Space shuttle program, it's a huge deal in the 80s. Mars Pathfinder and the Mars rover, huge deal in the 1990s. The Voyager missions in the late 70s all the way through into the 90s. Hubble telescope, guys, some of the imaging that has been captured from Hubble, like, for example, the Milky Way here, is stunning, and we are improving that technology in the 21st century. Improved communication. cellular devices and the internet, improved satellite technology that's grown dramatically in the last 20 to 30 years, global positioning systems. The growth and availability of GPS is remarkable and is not possible without satellites. When's the last time you guys unfurled a map, broke out a compass, and tried to figure out where you were going? It's probably been a while or never, right? I was actually on a hike a few years ago, and I had a map and a compass and trying to figure out where I was because I had no cell service. And I was like, man, I should probably like teach my kids how to do this. This is, yeah,
I do that. I
Nice.
know how to do that.
that's awesome.
I do backpacking.
It's a great skill, right? Improved personal communication devices, improved robotics, major focus for STEAM and STEM over the last 30 years. SpaceX, Elon Musk, and privatized space exploration. And then recent controversy over AI and OpenAI, right? What do you got here? Very cool. Yeah, I know. Guys, learn how to write, please. It will take you far. So on the top right, there's the Mars rover. That's Hubble in the middle, and then that's imaging from Hubble below on the bottom right. Questions up to this point? All right. Noteworthy events of the 90s. Hubble was launched into space. Nelson Mandela freed from prison in 90. Later elected as president of South Africa in 94. Collapse of the USSR. Operation Desert Storm began. And South Africa repealed apartheid in 91. Into the Cold War in 92. Riots in Los Angeles after the Rodney King verdict. Rodney King was beaten horribly by LA police in a routine traffic stop, and those officers were acquitted. And then the events of the Weaver family and the FBI at Ruby Ridge, Idaho in 1992. This is a really controversial event. The Weaver family tied to militia in this era. The FBI was trying to go in and sort of neutralize the situation, and they ended up killing FBI snipers, killed a couple of members of the Weaver family. This led to widespread protest and outrage, and it's going to lead to a far worse event that will happen in 1995. A lot of cult activity in the 90s. Cult compound of the Branch Davidian. Mount Carmel was their compound outside of Waco, Texas. They were led by David Koresh. Both the ATF and the FBI were involved in this. They thought the kids were in danger. They thought that they stockpiled weapons. It first started with a shootout, which left Koresh and a number of his followers wounded, as well as I can't remember how many ATF and FBI were wounded as a result. In turn, a firebomb was basically set off in the compound, and nearly everyone that was left in the compound died. This was very controversial. The use of internet. This was AOL dial-up in 93, which was a huge deal. It was super annoying, but it was revolutionary. And then the first attack on the World Trade Center occurred in 93. In 94, O.J. Simpson was arrested for double murder. That was like wildly publicized, not only the very slow chase of the white Bronco, but also the trial. The Rwandan genocide led to UN action in Rwanda. I don't know if anyone's ever seen Hotel Rwanda before, but highly recommended. The launch of Internet Explorer by Bill Gates in 94, that was revolutionary for the growth of technology and the internet. etc. Oklahoma City bombings by Timothy McVeigh killed 168 people in 1995. It's believed that this was in response to the events at Ruby Ridge. Sadly, a lot of the casualties at Oklahoma City were children because the side of the building that was bombed, there was a daycare there. The Unabomber Ted Kaczynski was arrested in 96. Hale-Bopp comet was visible in 97. Another cult committed mass suicide as a result of the return of Hale-Bopp, the Heaven's Gate cult. Yeah, it's pretty eerie. Mars Pathfinder sends back images from Mars. Huge deal in 97. The sheep Dolly was successfully cloned and lived for 6 years in Scotland. Clinton impeachment trial in 98 over the Lewinsky scandal. The euro introduced in 99. Fear of the Y2K bug. People were freaking out, but it got sorted out, and the market and computers and the world did not collapse. Very, very sad event. The mass murder at Columbine. There have been other school shootings. There had been a school shooting at the University of Texas. There had been one in Paducah, Kentucky, and a handful of others, but no one had ever seen anything like this. And sadly, that trend has continued, which is absolutely horrific. And the Panama Canal was returned to Panama in 1999. Remember, the president that started that process was Jimmy Carter. All right, so on the top left, we have Bill Gates. Bottom left, that's Clinton and Lewinsky. Top right, Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombings. And on the bottom right there, that's David Koresh and the tragedy in Waco. Numerous documentaries have been produced related to the Oklahoma City bombing and the Branch Davidian compound. All right. President George W. Bush. This is our first father-son combo since when for president? The Adams, very good, right? John Adams and John Quincy, father-son. Remember, we did have a grandfather and grandson, William Henry Harrison and Benjamin Harrison. Well, this is our second father-son combo. Bush wins the controversial 2000 election against Al Gore. This was actually decided by the Supreme Court in the case Bush v. Gore, which led to the election and inauguration of George W. Bush. The most significant event that occurred for Bush in his first term will be the terrorist attacks on U.S. soil on 9/11, 2001. Very, very tragic event in American history. This is one of the most pivotal events at the turn of the 20th century, if not the most pivotal event. The attacks on the World Trade Center in New York and the attack on the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. This led to heightened security at home as a result of 9/11. It also led to the passage of the Patriot Act and created the Department of Homeland Security. This also leads to both diplomatic and military initiatives, the war in Afghanistan in response to the terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda and the removal of the Taliban regime. That led to the loss of 2,459 service members. And in the war in Iraq, in search of weapons of mass destruction and toppling the regime of Saddam Hussein, led to the loss of 4,432 service members. A number of my friends were killed in action in these two wars. There's a local individual that I want to point out. Have y'all ever noticed the name Charlie Ransom or Charles Ransom pops up? There's streets named for him and different, like the VFW out in Midlothian named for him. He was killed in Afghanistan. Really, really great guy. We also have some graduates from here whose lives were lost during the War on Terror. These two wars will drag out, right? No Child Left Behind. This is the birth of the standard of learning, guys. The No Child Left Behind education program led to standardized testing. On the federal level, CORE, which was established for states that didn't set up their own testing, and then in the state of Virginia, we went with the standards of learning. Lack of regulation over Security and Exchange Commission and very reckless lending practices led to a major economic crisis, which led to the program TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, established in 2008. This is due to the housing market crash in 2008. The lending got crazy. You didn't have to prove employment. You didn't have to bring tax records to the table. You didn't even have to use your real name. They were just boom, 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 just nuts. Like pretty much everybody was getting loans, but these loans were super reckless because what they had attached to them were called balloons, meaning that if you didn't pay your loan off in a fixed period of time, you got a balloon rate that could be 3 or 4 times as much. Have your families ever talked about the impact that this had on them? I was a first-time home buyer in 2007 when the market crashed. Anybody want to guess how much value I lost in my first home? $70,000. Took us 7 years to recover just to get back to even. It was crazy. So, again, this doesn't lead to a Great Depression, but instead it leads to a great what? Recession. This will take us into a Great Recession that will be thrust into the lap of President Barack Obama. 9/11, here were the flight paths. American Airlines Flight 11 and United Airlines Flight 175, they hit the Twin Towers. American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, and then United 93 was headed back to Washington, but the crew took down, the passengers took down the plane in Shanksville. If any Pittsburgh Steelers fans are out there, if you ever see at Heinz Field, there's a huge sign at Heinz Field and it says, "Let's roll." That was the last thing that those passengers were recorded saying before they took out the pilot and the terrorists and the plane crashed in Shanksville. There's a huge monument in Shanksville that memorializes those lives lost on Flight 93. Top left, we have the attack on the Pentagon. Over on the right, the attack on the Twin Towers. This is one of those events, if you live through it, you will never forget where you were when it happened. Anybody's families impacted? Whoa, that's wild. Yeah.
My grandma's office was directly across the Pentagon from where the plane crashed into it.
Whoa.
We had a window overlooking it.
Unbelievable. Bottom left, U.S. service members in Afghanistan. All right. President Barack Obama, 09 to 17, first African-American president in U.S. history. Main goal was to change the American healthcare system. Elected in 2008 and 12 defeated John McCain, senator from Arizona, and Vietnam vet, and Mitt Romney from Utah. Forced with a major economic crisis that was caused by the collapse of the American housing market and near collapse of the global banking system. This caused high rates of unemployment. This led to the stimulus package to bail out the banks. Highly recommended books and films, The Big Short and Too Big to Fail. Has anyone seen either one of those? Highly recommended. Ending the war in Iraq, which doesn't end until 2011, and the war in Afghanistan, which won't end until 2021. Uprisings in North Africa, Egyptian and Libyan conflicts, and the death of Osama bin Laden, Operation Zero Dark 30 in Pakistan. September 11, 2012, attack on the U.S. Embassy in Benghazi, Libya, created a great deal of controversy as well. International crisis in North Korea, potential missile launch sites and genocide. In Iran, nuclear threats. In Syria, civil war and the rise of ISIS. And in Russia and Ukraine, control of Crimea, which led to a larger invasion in 2022. Horrible event, the Sandy Hook Elementary shooting in 2012, pushed for background checks. For some bizarre reason, there are people out there that have tried to say that that was a conspiracy that didn't happen, which is horrifically shameful. These were elementary children that were killed in a mass murder. Boston Marathon bombings in April of 2013, domestic terror attack. Much love to my buddy Dick Donahue. He was one of the cops that survived trying to take out the the suspects. He had to have a full blood transfusion and nearly died, survived. Really great guy. He had served in the Navy and then went into the law enforcement. NSA leaks were a focal point of concern. Edward Snowden went into exile as a result of the leaks. Paris Climate Accords to combat global warming. Controversial because we join, we leave, we join, we leave. That'll be interesting to watch unfold. Crusader for Universal Healthcare, Obamacare, but that's become controversial as well because of the availability to said healthcare. President Donald Trump, 2017 to 2021, reality show host, real estate mogul turned politician. Trump defeated Hillary Clinton, former U.S. Senator, Secretary of State, and wife of former President Bill Clinton in the election of 2016. This is one of the most tense mudslinging campaigns in modern American history. Like, would harken back to the things that we talked about, like in the 1820s, right? It was pretty nasty. Trump's 304 electoral college votes to Clinton's 227 carried him to the White House. The election results swirled with rumors of Russian involvement, hacking, espionage, U.S. espionage. Numerous reports were made. No concrete evidence. Trump promised to crack down on immigration, build a U.S.-Mexican border wall, tax cuts, improve veteran affairs, repeal Obamacare, destroy ISIS, and improve the economy by creating, jobs and improving trade. Not all of those things were achieved. Trump signed an executive order to levy a controversial travel ban. That was contested by the courts early on, and the travel ban was lifted. This is where Trump's squabbling with the DOJ started from the very beginning. He called for a Syrian airstrike as a result of nerve gas used by Syria. He also called for the use of Moab, the mother of all bombs. This is the largest bomb we had dropped since Nagasaki. This is not nuclear, though. on Afghanistan. Quite a bit of saber rattling with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in his first 100 days. He'll go on to become the first sitting president to meet with the North Korean leader. He and Un formally met in steps toward North Korea's denuclearization, but no such luck. They're still doing their thing. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with North Korea in our lifetime. Because more and more defectors continue to head out of North Korea. The UN provided a report of genocide that's about that thick to the world for what they need to understand that's happening within those borders, because defectors have come out and explained the horrible atrocities that the North Korean people are living under. Trump was able to nominate 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court in his first term. Government shutdown over the U.S.-Mexico border wall. Trade war with China, it actually started in the first term. COVID-19 global pandemic. The COVID-19 quarantine started in the U.S. in March of 2020 with dramatic effect. Trump was impeached twice, acquitted twice, later convicted of 34 felony accounts in 2024 related to business practices, and as we know, will be reelected to a non-consecutive term. Joe Biden, 2021 to 2025, enforced the American Rescue Plan in the early days of his administration to jumpstart the economy and to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Focus on improved American infrastructure, Build Back America program, roads, bridges, dams, airports, etc. Appointed Justice Jackson to the Supreme Court. Jackson became the first African-American female justice to sit on the court. Pushed for the Safer Communities Act to combat gun violence, expand mental health services, and to provide safety measures in schools. This was largely in response to Robb Elementary down in Uvalde, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact of the events at Parkland or the events in Las Vegas. There are numerous examples. The CHIPS and Science Act to bring back technology manufacturing in the U.S. This has a really big impact on Virginia. The PACT Act to improve veteran health care. The Marriage Equality Act, this is on the heels of the Obergefell case of 2015 to legalize same-sex marriage. The Inflation Reduction Act, landmark legislation to bring down costs for families. Lower prescription drug prices, which actually was bipartisan, one of the few bipartisan events here, and made historic investments in American clean energy jobs and manufacturing. That obviously controversial because that impacts the fossil fuel market. Executive orders to protect reproductive rights after Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Dobbs case in 2022. Historic climate action by rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. Staunch support for Ukraine. Historic visit to Kiev in February of 2023, not in the 19s, sorry. Student debt forgiveness, very controversial. A lot of those people that received debt forgiveness, well, they're back on the hook. Why would this be controversial in both parties? Yeah, they don't want to use tax dollars to pay for loans. And supported Israel in the recent war with Hamas, but has pushed for a 2-state solution in the war. Continues to push for that in the post-presidency. And then timeline 2020 to 2023, the impeachment trial for President Donald Trump begins on January 16, 2020. Trump was acquitted by the Senate. The first coronavirus case in the U.S. reported in Washington State January 20, 2020. The World Health Organization declared the coronavirus a pandemic on March 11th, 2020. Trump declared a national emergency amid the coronavirus pandemic. I'm sure you all remember March 13, right? Hey guys, see you in 2 weeks. Yeah, right. It's kind of interesting. I had a fourth period class. It's like, how long do you think this is going to last? I'm like, I have no idea. I'm like, for what it's worth, like we dodged, bless you. We dodged a really big like swine flu issue in the early 2000s. And I'm like, well, the Spanish flu lasted 2 years. So, and it was like 2 years. The Dow plunged nearly 3,000 points in the worst drop since Black Monday in '87 on March 16, 2020. Recently, April of 2025, we had a similar plunge due to the tariff war. George Floyd killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota during an arrest for using a counterfeit $20 bill on May 25th. This will ignite the Black Lives Matter BLM protests to take place nationwide for racial justice and police brutality. The removal of Confederate statues and monuments nationwide from June 2020 through 2021. This had widespread impact, especially in Virginia, that led to protests in Richmond on Monument Avenue. It also led to a horrible event in Charlottesville that led to the death of protesters. National plans to resume primary, secondary, and higher education in the U.S. in 2021 through 2022. 2020 U.S. presidential election, Biden defeated Trump in November of 2020. January 6, 2021, the Capitol insurrection in D.C. to overturn the presidential election. 5 deaths and over 170 injuries, many of which were police officers. One of the most tragic and absurd events in modern American history. Not everybody's going to be happy after an election, right? That does not mean we totally destroy our democratic republic because we're not happy with election results. That was unacceptable. That is fascism. Okay? I just want to make that crystal clear, because if I don't, I'm not doing my job. We don't destroy democracy. We go back out and get involved and go vote the next go round. All right? We do not, I think we've learned through World War II and through the Cold War, we do not want to live under dictatorial fascist rule where all rights are taken away. Okay? Russian invasion of Ukraine, February 24th, 2022. The war in Ukraine continues with U.S. support for Ukraine. 19 students and 2 teachers killed by a gunman at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas on May 24th. Deadliest school shooting since Sandy Hook in 2012. June 24th, 2022, the Dobbs case, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, will overturn Roe v. Wade. AI software ChatGPT launched November of 2022. Teachers' heads were exploding off their necks. Just kidding, but people were freaking out. Guys, don't depend on that. Learn to write. It's important. It will carry you far. Musk changes Twitter to X in July of 23. Hamas invasion of Israel October 7, 2023, and that's led to a brutally destructive war in Palestine. Questions up to this point? So COVID-19, top left, top right, mural in Minneapolis in honor of George Floyd. Bottom left, Trump and Biden debating in 2020, and over there on the right, the insurrection. 47th U.S. President Donald Trump, in a very controversial decision, President Joe Biden decided not to seek re-election in July of 2024. In relation to his health, he did contract COVID, but also his debate in June was a disaster. An assassination attempt was made on Trump on July 13 during a campaign stop in Pennsylvania. That wasn't the first one. There was another attempted assassination at a golf course, but Secret Service snubbed that one out. The Democratic Party nominated Vice President Kamala Harris on August 5th without a primary. This created a great deal of controversy among both parties because a presidential primary had not been carried out. Trump defeated Harris in the election of 2024 to become the 47th U.S. president, second U.S. president to be elected to a non-consecutive term, first since Grover Cleveland in the late 1800s. Trump ran on campaign promises to clamp down on immigration, cut taxes, cut government spending, raise U.S. tariffs, end the war in Gaza, end the war in Ukraine, and a plan to annex Greenland and the Panama Canal Zone, which doesn't make very much sense, especially the Panama Canal Zone. Greenland makes very little sense, but the Panama Canal Zone, Panama is a close ally to the U.S., and we benefit from the Panama Canal Zone being operated and controlled by Panama. And that's a point of national pride for Panama. Trump entered office with sweeping executive orders, pardon the January 6th insurrectionists. There's a lot of controversial things that have happened in the first that had happened in the first 100 days. That's got to be one of the top ones because this was a blanket pardon, and law enforcement, many members in law enforcement, especially in DC, are very upset that this took place. Has rejected and revoked DEI measures, empowered Elon Musk to lead the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE to cut government jobs and spending. Highly controversial because this is a similar thing. They did massive cuts. They did not do vetting, and they have cut into a great deal of major medical research. This has had a horrible impact on the CDC. Very contentious public meeting with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in the Oval Office. Talks with Israel to bring about an end to the war in Gaza, but got a lot of backlash there because talked about turning the Gaza Strip into a resort community, which is not going to happen. Deported a large number of migrants to El Salvador, among them Abrego Garcia, who was sent by mistake and is yet to be returned to the U.S. Battled with the Department of Justice, bringing a lot of decisions into constitutional questioning and overreach. Launched a tariff war that has dramatically impacted the American and global economy since April of 2025. Some of those tariffs have been rolled back, and it's created quite a bit of global market upheaval. Currently working on trade deals with the Brits, as well as a visit to the Middle East to discuss everything from trade to ending the war in Gaza. Questions up to this point?